Good afternoon, everyone. Just checking you can hear me, see me, and hopefully see some slides. If some kind soul could just send me back a little bit of reassurance via the chat box, that would make me feel a lot better. As I'm sitting here in splendid isolation. Thanks, Melinda. Thanks, Gail. Excellent, Stuart, Valentine, superb. And as we're talking about introductions today, let's take the opportunity perhaps to introduce ourselves, shall we? We're not a huge number, we're about 35 so far. A few more will probably join in, but feel free to just introduce yourself in the chat box. That way we can watch the introductions scrolling along. We can work on them in the course of the call, and you can even get to introduce yourself 2 or 3 times if you wish, because guess what? That's what we're talking about today. So feel free to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, and whatever you might normally say by way of introduction. Lots of familiar faces, so I know who you are, but you don't know each other, and your introduction will be visible to everyone, so feel free to do that. Okay, I'll start. You feel free to keep typing, and I will look down there from time to time to see what sort of things you are typing. Cool. Let us begin. Why are we doing this topic? It's important. It's quite an important gateway to opportunity. The way in which we introduce ourselves, those very first seconds and minutes of introduction, either in a group setting or in a social setting, can actually be quite significant for what happens next. It does, probably for that reason, cause a lot of anxiety. I know of this both from watching body language in a group setting where you see people nervously fidgeting until it comes to their turn. Usually not because they're impatient, usually because they just want to get the ordeal over with. Or in other cases, people have told me on coaching calls that these settings where they have to introduce themselves to groups of people are actually awkward for them. So I'm really happy to see that some of you are seizing the reins, as Kate just has, and actually doing an introduction in terms of what you do, who you are, and whatever else you might normally say by way of introduction. You're not stuck with this, by the way. You get to do it several times in the course of the call, whenever you feel like it. And we can all just watch the introduction scroll through as we go. No need for anxiety today. Also, it often pains me to realize just how many opportunities get lost, not just because of how people introduce themselves, but how they talk about their work generally. There are so many openings that could be made. There are so many introductions and referrals and recommendations that could happen if people just did a little tweak. And we're going to look at some of those tweaks on this call. And there's a pretty obvious link, I think, with self-worth. I think it's obvious. I could talk about it for ages. Don't let me. If you want to get more of that, just get your hands on that. Self-worth Safari, details at the end of the call. So let's, what are we going to do? Talk a little bit about the angst, first of all. Look at some of the cliches or the pitfalls we might want to stay out of. And some of you may go, oops, but let's not worry. We're in a safe space. We're going to look at 4 fairly time-honored structures that work, as in, I didn't make them up last month. They've been around for quite a long time, in some cases around for about 20 years that I know of, and many probably around even longer. These are 4, and they're like 4 alternatives. You don't have to use all of them, but feel free to choose whatever one works best for you. We'll do a few general tips, like what happens if you're in transition, and then there'll be a little bit of homework at the end, if you want it. Again, up to you whether you wish to avail of that or not. So let's talk about the angst for a minute. I saw this on Facebook recently, and to me it was symptomatic of the angst. Why is it that the simple question, what do you do, is so traumatic? Now we can, of course, ask that in many interesting ways. And as at least one person on this call knows, I had a little contest running with myself last year, which was how many days could I go without asking somebody what did they do. And I do really relate to the some of the alternatives that are here. I like it. But as I began to walk around in those shoes for a while, it occurs to me, yeah, we're not necessarily dealing with the core issue here, because a lot of the opportunities that come our way, both in career and in a business setting, come from our peripheral network. And just not talking about what we do isn't really enabling us to capitalize on that. The second thing that happens is, yes, we can be very creative and a little bit weird, and some might even say a little bit gimmicky in how we answer these questions, but there's a price to be paid for that, i.e. the loss of the opportunity above. And let's face it, work is a pretty important aspect of life. So why should this question be so traumatic? Rather than avoid it, why don't we instead find better ways to answer it rather than maybe indulge in the angst? And there's other reasons for the angst too. Having just written a book on self-worth, it's hardly surprising that one of the possibilities might be that maybe I don't value what I do enough. Another possibility for some might be I have a dislike of social interaction. So any kind of what do you do question is a bit traumatic. Maybe someone is in career transition. There are specific difficulties that apply when you're in transition that actually we will talk about later on, because that does pose a certain amount of challenges. And for at least a few people I know, they just regard their job as so boring, they can't possibly imagine that anybody else would be interested in it. So they just hate being asked, what do you do? Because they go, yeah, I'm just a ... And you can usually hear it in the tone of voice with which they respond. Any others apart from those I've listed? When I'm looking down, I'm looking at your responses. Apart from those I've listed, what are the other reasons for the angst? What else might be creating the trauma around this question? Yep. Indeed, difficulty describing it, Brian has just mentioned. Sometimes it is quite hard to know what the words are. And of course, sometimes we do a lot of different things. I mean, this is in the age of the portfolio career, as Charles Handy described it some 20 plus, 25 years ago now, or even more. You know, what happens when you have 3, 4, 5 jobs? Like, which one are you going to talk about? Yeah, the being put in a box. I think many people relate to that, Kate. If there's a recurring phrase that keeps coming up when this topic does, it's often, I just don't want to be put in a box. And the feeling is, or the fear is, that when we answer that question, we get instantly pigeonholed. I'm hoping that some of the structures today will help with that. Gail's mentioned, yes, working in an industry that generates a lot of debate. Sometimes you might just not welcome that on a social occasion, and I can well believe that you'd probably like to have it another topic of conversation in that case. Yeah. Will it interest them? Indeed. Well, by the time we do some work here, hopefully it will. Let's look at what we want to avoid doing first. Now, you might not agree with me on these. I'll put them forward as a point of view, and you'll be welcome to share your own at the end, because everyone has their own allergic reactions. The first one I would say to avoid is any sentence that starts, I am a. I am an accountant, I am a coach, I am a trainer, I am a lawyer, I am a IT developer, or whatever. Not because there's something wrong with it, or because, you know, not because you're not, but the problem is it's the least interesting way to introduce yourself, and it is the most likely to pigeonhole you. So I would suggest that one of the things we want to get rid of is the I am a type introduction. And if you find yourself scrolling back up going, oops, that's exactly what I did, well, that's why we're here, right? The second one, which I don't think anyone has, unless I missed it, is the talking CV, as I call it. It's a heart sink experience when I meet these people, because I know they're going to go on for a half an hour if I let them. And they start by telling you where they were born and what training they did and what their first degree was in and why they decided to move on and what their first job was. And you're kind of thinking, oh my God, you are over 40. We're going to be here for another half an hour. The talking CV can get to be incredibly dull and usually has us listeners looking for the fire exits in order to get away. Really, talking through your life to date is perhaps not the most powerful form of introducing yourself, no matter how interesting that was, of course. Ditto, talking through educational qualifications. It's the same point, but it's specifically often around what people have studied. We are more than what we've studied. I see Michelle has a very interesting picture there. Hi, Barry. What else? Generic benefit statements. These became very fashionable around 10 years ago. The kind of one sentence summary like that goes, oh, I help investors make more money, or I help companies improve their profits. These great big kind of generic one-liners that were supposed to impress that mythic CEO when you met him in an elevator. So they were often called the elevator pitch. And many of them were so bland, generic, and so synthetic in their construction that it's highly dubious if they ever impressed any CEO in an elevator. But hey, maybe that's just my allergy. You probably have yours. Any others? Anything that you're allergic to? What kind of introductions just don't work for you when you're hearing them? Hesitancy, Simon says. I hesitate to ask you for an example, Simon. Actually, seeing that reminds me of something. In preparing today, I'm very conscious that it's a webinar, and therefore I focus very much on the verbal side of this. I have to be honest and say that a very large part of it is in the body language when we're meeting face to face. And indeed, that hesitancy or flitting eye contact that Simon might have been thinking of when he used the word hesitancy, that too can be a very important part of it. If we were doing this in a more workshop face-to-face environment, there'd be a lot more on that. There isn't much on it today. And as I think about that, that's a bit of an omission in this topic, because a large part of it is not the words we use, it's the body language and the general demeanor and tone we adopt when we're talking about ourselves. So I acknowledge that today is focusing very much on the verbal part of that communication. Jargon, technical details, people talking about themselves a lot. Yes, we'll be back to that in a moment, Julia. That happens. All of these are indeed probably the kinds of things we don't want to be doing. So we're going to look at a twin shift. Julia will like one of these. First off is switching from talking about ourselves to talking about others. Now, why should we do that? Well, almost any of us are involved in serving other people or other organizations, depending on what our job is, what our career is. So when we actually switch from talking about ourselves to talking about other people, that's usually considerably more interesting. And the second and twin shift that runs alongside this, some of you on the call will know it, it's not talking about our content or our stuff or our technical jargon or whatever it might be, and instead talking about the wider context that makes that valuable. So if we look at the two together, we're going to practice these in the 4 structures that follow. Notice that all of them are about switching from self to others and about switching from content to context. And that those 2 threads run through the four structures that follow. Now, this comes with a warning, because what you're about to experience is probably going to make you so aware of how self-preoccupied people really are when they introduce themselves. And this can be a bit of a heart sink when you go out socializing and you listen, or you go to a workshop, or you go to a training event and you listen to how others introduce themselves. You could become quite aware, like never before, that people are perhaps very self-preoccupied. Sorry about that, but it kind of goes with the territory. Looked at positively, it's your opportunity to shine. So first, a quick introduction to the four structures. So number one is describe what you've been doing today, who you've been working with, and what their challenge is. It's a very simple way of talking about what do you do, and it's giving a very simple example called, well, for example, today I appeared in court to defend somebody who was charged with ... That's much more interesting than I am a lawyer. The second structure, we'll go through these in detail. The second is talk about your favorite clients or your ideal clients. And if you have many, well, just pick one. So you can talk about your ideal clients or your ideal projects, if that makes more sense. Either works really well. Yep, nothing makes you more interesting to a person than making them talk about themselves. Indeed, thank you, Magnus. With all of these, we'll be tacking questions on the end to do exactly that. Third one, focusing on the trigger points. The reason I'm usually called in is the reason the reason that people reach out to me is. So the focus here is on the trigger points, i.e. the context that triggers people to reach out to you. It's a very good way to educate your market about the kind of people you want to reach. And you know how pain, benefit, gain, or pain, shift, gain, it's been around quite a long time. Some of you will have heard me do this before, but it's included here today simply because it works so well, and it's I'll detail that. It's probably hard to understand just from the way it's written, but I will detail it in a moment, one by one. So let's start with the first one. Today I'm working with. If anybody wants to try this, as I'm, even if you've already introduced yourself, feel free to do it again. Today I'm working with a few little caveats first, just before you hit enter. Number one, of course, is watch for client confidentiality. I mean, it's so bleeding obvious that we might forget it. But when we're saying today I'm working with, of course, you do run the risk of betraying something you shouldn't have. So we obviously have to watch for that. So you may have to go, instead of saying I work with company name, you may have to say I work with a large IT provider who, or something like that. The power of this lies in the fact that it illustrates a typical client situation. And this is very powerful because what often happens with introductions is they're so broad and generic, they don't go in. We cannot hear them. Precisely because they are so broad and generic. The person speaking the term knows what they mean. I work with companies who have a growth mindset. Yeah, you know what you mean by that, but we, the listener, probably don't. If we can use a more specific client situation or client challenge, then it's much easier for us to understand growth mindset. We can describe the standard or the typical complications and issues that arise, again, much as in the previous point. It shows the context in which you are valuable. So it's talking about them and it's talking about their context, exactly as we've described already. Again, you don't have to say what you're doing, particularly, you simply describe their challenge and what they want to do. And in that way, it's a very powerful way of demonstrating the shift, if you like, that you bring about in your project management or your training or your coaching, as the case may be. So today I've been working with, or this month I've been working with, or this week I've been working with, obviously you know how to adapt this to suit yourself. Second one, any examples of that before we move on? Anyone like to try it? Today I'm working with, or this week I'm working with. I'll come back to that, Simon. It just gives an example. It doesn't define, it doesn't box you into. You can go on to say that you do other things, but it is a fair point. However, the trade-off here is that by giving an example, we're usually more impactful. So the depth of that more than, or that the force of that, usually more than compensates for the trying to be all-encompassing and all-inclusive. So Melinda says, today I'm working with a female manager who needs to raise her game after a promotion. Now I would love to scroll back up if I could find it fast enough and just see how that relates to Melinda's previous introduction, but I can't find it in the chat. Sorry, I won't take up time with it. Currently, I'm working with a group of my colleagues finding out how digital transformation could impact us and what we can do about it. Right. Okay. So, I mean, you can always go on to say this is an example of what I do, of course. How about today I am working with, and tomorrow I am working with? Well, yeah, depends on which day of the week we meet you, Simon. But yes, obviously we don't want to overwhelm them. But it can. It's a perfectly valid way of showing that, you know, today I'm working with a small company, and next month or tomorrow I'm working with a large global PLC. These are two reasonable examples. We'd then probably want to go on and say that the common thread in all of the work I do is ... Otherwise, we just run the risk of being too generic. Kate, this week I'm focusing on our sales strategy. What I would love to hear more of is the context there. So that's content. What would be useful is the context. So this week I'm focusing on a sales strategy in the context of more globalized supply chains, more and more trade barriers going up, whatever the specific issues are. That makes, again, the more we talk about context rather than content, then the more powerful this becomes. I'm currently working with a large rail transportation manufacturer that is moving into a new market, and the challenges they face are ... Exactly that. Cool. Let's move on. Feel free to keep typing, by the way. Cursor has escaped. Here we are. Okay. This one is, again, quite similar. It will have the same issues as Simon just raised about, well, will you be talking about a too narrow range? And we'll come back to that. In essence, it's a similar, it just starts from a different place. It steers the listener towards whom your ideal client is. So today you might not be working with your ideal client, but tomorrow you might like to be. So what this does is it puts the focus on where you want to go rather than where you already are. Particularly important if you're in transition, of course. If you already know what your ideal looks like. So my favorite client projects are, the perfect client for me right now is someone who ... Steers you towards the ideal, allows you to talk about them, not about yourself. Of course, this is precisely where we want to go. Where possible, a bit like the growth mindset example earlier, try to use observable traits rather than abstract concepts. So for example, and by the way, one of the great ways of introducing this is the use of the words "and for example." I would like to, my perfect client is somebody who's frustrated with the job they're currently in and constantly feels they're being devalued in every interaction. Even that's a bit abstract, actually. But frustration, describing emotions are quite good. I work with people who feel anxious about their presentations. I work with people who feel ... Feelings help us to connect at quite a deep level. Yeah, reading some of there's quite an interesting collection appearing here. Yeah, today I'm working with, yeah, again, just looking at Fiona's, the one that's just come in, I'm working on, so why is that important to them? Would be where I'd be going there, Fiona. And throughout this, whenever you want to get away from the abstract and make it real, you just drop in the words, for example. Ashok has said, today I'm reviewing a report from the regulators from a compliance visit to a professional client, dealing with things like, for example, ... Again, yes, the perfect client for me is a firm who's struggling with motivating and connecting their employees, for example. Actually, you can probably tag, for example, onto the end of every one of these structures, and it adds punch to it. Cool. So for the next few contributions, try to add the words, for example. Let's see where that takes us. Okay, let's move along to the third one. Number 3 coming up, time check, 27, yeah, we're okay. The reason I'm usually called is, so these are the trigger points. Again, not dissimilar to the idea of clients. The great thing about the trigger points is it makes it easy for others to recognize the needs. So going back to Kate's example just in front of us, the perfect client is the firm who's struggling with how to motivate and connect there. So the reason I'm usually called is when firms are struggling with how to motivate and connect with their employees. For example, they've just lost a key manager and that's really impacting their operation. So the trigger points is they've just lost a key manager, or the trigger points is they've tried a recruitment campaign and it's not worked, or the trigger points is they're recruiting people in, all right, but it's a revolving door and they're revolving out, they're becoming a training ground for other companies. These are the trigger points. So it's good to focus on trigger points because it helps other people to refer you business, or it helps other people to refer you job opportunities. All of this works perfectly well in career development and career search, just as well as it works in client search. In fact, what often happens is there's a tendency right now in career coaching, bit of a rant coming up, I'll keep it short. There's a tendency in career coaching to focus very much on your own passion and purpose, your own values, your own talents, your own strengths, blah, 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 blah. You get the pattern. And what's often missing is the same amount of attention being given to the others' trigger points or the others' challenges that would actually help us to connect with the people we want to reach in the first place. And the pin seems to have swung very much into the chorus of passion and purpose. And you'll gather that this approach here consciously, allows for that, but also then urges us with self-worth intact to go out there and become curious about the trigger points and about the needs of other people. So what is it in particular that educates a company that they need to do things differently about attracting and retaining staff? Okay, reading the last one from Catherine. Sorry, just scroll back up, Catherine, 1 second. So my favorite client are those at a crossroads and needs an objective insight on next step options. Okay, that's a concept, Catherine. So we'd need a for example there. Oh, yeah, you have. Sorry, keep reading, John. For example, the transformation is not progressing as well as expected and they're frustrated by lack of results. Okay, could we have a more specific example? That feels a bit conceptual for me. I would love to hear, for example, a media company who is in a changing marketplace and who cannot just carry on doing the same things as they were doing before. Or a design company who is impacted by Brexit and is worried about their future pipeline. or again, similar comment on Fiona's. My favorite clients are brands who are struggling. Struggling with what? Struggling with things like, changing demographics, millennial consumer demand being different to previous generations. Let's hear some of the specific issues that people are struggling with. Struggling is a concept. Struggling with things like ABC helps us to connect. A lot of my work is actually about taking stuff from the conceptual level to the example level. You'll probably have gathered from the comments I'm just making. Oh, I've just missed a load. Yeah, I would love to hear the example there, Simon. The reason people use my services is to generate options, sure. So for example, the power of that would be in the example. Okay, back to slides. So we want to make it easy for other people to introduce us, and we want to make it easy for them to recognize the needs that we serve. One tip here is describe why that's important. This is particularly important right now because of ... This is particularly important right now because of increased regulatory control. This is particularly important right now because of changing consumer buying habits. This is particularly important right now because customers are more conscious of sustainability than ever, etc. Health and wellness has just appeared in front of me. This is particularly important right now where mental health is now on the agenda of just about every organization. For example, Polly, yay, there we go, that's it, exactly that. Okay, thanks Janet. Moving back to the fourth one. The fourth one has been around for a long time. Some of you will have heard me do this before. It's a series of clauses, so I'll just put them all on the slide and then we'll talk them through. Oops, too fast. Yeah, so you know how situation. So you know how a lot of owner-managed companies are struggling with their pipeline at the moment. Issues around economic uncertainty, issues around trade barriers, and so on, which means that it's very hard for clause C, which means that it's very hard for them to plan. They are terrified of making investments in marketing and training. And what I help them to do is, I help them to see some fresh options, thinking of Simon. I help them to retain their key people, thinking of Kate, etc., which means that they can actually at least make some short-term plans to grow their business, as a result of which they're still in the market for the long term. Thinking of my own business, you know, I work with a lot of consultants and managers and technical people who are in commoditized marketplaces where the value of what they're doing is constantly being reduced and discounting is rampant, which means that very often they're working harder not only to win the business, but also to deliver it. And what I help them to do is to be more impactful in their business communications and to value themselves and their work, which means that they can go out there with greater determination in the morning and have more impact because they're talking about their clients' challenges rather than their own, as a result of which they make more profit in less time. Didn't even bother rehearsing that, but it's an example. The nice thing about this structure is that it actually teases out the pain and the gain, and it does it in, there's like two onion layers of each, if that makes sense. So what you see here is the initial pain, the impact of the pain. Then you describe the shift, then you have the gain, and you have the impact of the gain. It's a very, even rehearsing that for your own usage, even if you never use it with a client or with a customer, it helps you to get clear of what you're about. It helps you to get clear about the risks that you help them avoid and the gains that you help them to realize. So that's why that one has been around for a very long time and works really well. Um, it's a little bit longer than your standard elevator pitch, which is often only about half that length. Um, yep, I see there's some super examples flying in here. What this does is it helps you to think through the pain that you avoid, as well as the gain that you give. And very often it's the pain that you avoid, sorry, the pain that you help them to avoid, that is actually the highest value, or that has the higher value, particularly in the current climate. If you could help somebody avoid pain or avoid risk, that probably carries more value than some future nebulous benefit that might or might not happen. Apparently, people are many times more motivated to avoid pain or avoid risk than they are to capitalize on gain. This is equally true in a career context as it is in a personal one. Okay, feel free to keep typing. This is a good practice ground, and you can also comment and question or probe what other people have written. A few general tips as we go. Time check 36, we're okay. You want to be reasonably consistent. There should be a red line running through everything. And if not, then that probably needs some attention. It can be a challenge because, in my own case, I work on issues of productivity as well as client management, as well as promotion and marketing. So you sometimes wonder what the red line is. It took me quite a long time to understand what it was, which is that the constant thread that runs through everything I do is how we value ourselves and how we value our work. So learning to look at that through fresh eyes, for me, is the red thread. Now, whether it's an issue of engaging a team together or whether it's an issue of being more impactful with our existing business development or avoiding discounting or whatever it is, the constant red thread that runs through the tapestry, if you like, is bringing more or valuing ourselves and our work in a more clear way, in a more vivid way. So what do you want to be remembered for is the question. What's the consistency of approach here, or the consistency of challenge, that if you prefer that term, that you bring to your client interactions. And in all of this, we want to equip others to tell our story, because if we have to tell our own story time and time again, that's hard work. If we can equip others to tell our story, then it takes an awful lot of the load out of marketing. Marketing can be hard, particularly for self-employed professionals, solopreneurs, independent professionals, etc. Marketing can be a real trudge. And the only way out of that, long term, is to equip other people to tell your story so well that you simply don't have to. And that makes a heck of a difference to the working week. And therefore, it follows, if we're going to equip others to tell our story, you cannot just rehearse this with the mirror. You've got to engage with other people who help you to see what you might have difficulty seeing for yourself. I joked about this morning. I sent some of the Self-Worth Academy facilitator training curriculum to my colleague Sonia in the Netherlands, and she made some great comments on it. And I was reading through her comments, shaking my head, going, you just cannot cut your own hair. In theory, we might have the skills, but we lack the perspective. I missed 3-4 absolutely obvious things that needed to be in that document that just weren't. That's the power of actually rehearsing with other people, testing with other people, and getting their feedback. It helps us to see the things that we otherwise find it very hard to see for ourselves. And in all of this, going back to introducing ourselves, we will want to judge the situation we're in. If I'm going down the pub on a Friday night, I may use a slightly shorter version of the you-know-how, structure number 4, than I might if I was in a conference room or at a conference. So, of course, we will be paying a bit of attention to how formal, how informal it is, how technical is this environment or not, and adapting accordingly. It's constantly a case of adapting to purpose. I'd like to talk a little bit about career transition, simply because so many people are in career transition. Even those who are in their own business are sometimes in transition with their own business. And therefore, our intent when we go out in transition, now if you know what you're transitioning to, well, the issue largely disappears. But for many, they just don't. I'm living in Lisbon. A lot of people are passing through Lisbon in transition. They are here to be an explorer, much as the Portuguese were before. They are here to try out different things and maybe try a bit of communications, try a bit of coaching, try a bit of academia, see what works, decide what they want to do for the longer term. If you're in transition, you probably find it hard to talk about the what. This is a good time to talk about the why. So why are you in transition? What is it about the previous work or portfolio or project management or whatever that doesn't quite do it for you? Why is that important? What would be a better why rather than, because we can focus on the why rather than the what. In fact, if you've seen Simon Sinek's video, the recommendation is to always focus on the what, to start with why rather than what. We need, however, a little caveat here. The details of your personal journey to India or wherever you've just been might well be interesting, but if you want to have really compelling introductions or whys, then we need to look for the challenges that also apply to other people. Otherwise, we're back to our own story again. And there's, as you've probably experienced yourself, own stories can get a bit dull, particularly when they're told at great length. Every conversation that you have is an opportunity to explore. In fact, one of the, even if you're not in transition, this is always worthwhile bearing in mind. Every conversation is an opportunity to explore, and even sometimes to get introductions to the people that you don't know. That lovely Dan Sullivan line from years ago that goes, how does it go? All the money you will ever want is already in the hands of the people you know or the people to whom they can introduce you. Well, the same is true of career opportunities. The same is true of business openings. You know, everything we will ever want is already in the hands of the people we know or the people to whom they can introduce us. We're back to the power of that peripheral network that I mentioned in the very opening slide. So, if you're game, a little bit of homework for you. I'll keep an eye on the question box, by the way, if there's anything that I've not covered here that you would like me to. But let me put this up first. So, question one, who are the people that I want to be working with, basically? So, because, you know, we can make money doing many things, but who are the people you want to be interacting with day to day? When you get up in the morning and you look in your diary, you see what's coming up for the day ahead, you know, how do you want to feel? Who needs to be in there for that day to be a good day? In my case, for example, I no longer work with people, no matter how much they want to pay me, who simply want to achieve commercial objectives unless they're also interested in the human journey. So if the human dimension of business development isn't on the table, it's like, sorry, not for me. So if you just want to be, you know, if you just want to get more hits on your website and you want to set up a set of processes to get more hits on your website, that's for somebody else to work on. I'm, you know, only want to work with people who are up for discussing the human experience of business development. If that isn't on the table, sorry, not my bag. Why is that important? Well, and for them, by the way. Sorry, that question is for you. I can answer it for me. Why, you know, when you define who are the people that you want to work with, why is that important for them? Yeah, not just for you. We tend to answer in terms of for you. I can go on for ages about why I want to have human conversations and not transaction conversations. But that's just me. That's not the point here. Why is that important for them? That's the point. Why is that important for them in my case is quite simple. Business development has to be sustainable. And if it's just a transaction, it's not going to be sustainable. If people are going to be able to do it for 5 years, for 10 years, then they need to be able to do it in a human-friendly way. Otherwise, they're not going to keep it up. They may well keep up that very promotional campaign for 6 months, more likely 6 weeks. But if it isn't enjoyable to do, then it's not going to be sustainable. So why is that important for them? That's the question. Big question, how is their world changing? How is their future going to be different to the past? So if you want to work in strategy, okay, so how is their world in the food industry going to be different in the future than it was in the past? Or if you're in coaching and training, how does the future of coaching and training look different to the past? Actually, wrong question, just caught myself. If you're doing coaching and training in the pharmaceuticals industry, how will the pharmaceuticals industry be, how will their future be different to their past? It's not how is your world changing, how's their world changing? It's very slippery, isn't it? Nearly fell into it while giving you the homework. How is their world changing, not how is your world changing? Again, everyone tends to answer the latter question. The self-preoccupation in career coaching bothers me, as you may well have gathered by now. What problems does that pose? Again, for emphasis, for them, not for you. So what happens if they don't attract and retain the right people? What happens if they don't make that strategic shift? What happens if they don't integrate their social media with their other marketing channels? What happens if they ignore millennium buying habits, etc.? What are the challenges? What are the problems? And then 5 questions into the process, you're allowed to ask, how are my talents relevant in that context? If you look on Self-Worth Academy, there's a set of resources that they might not be there yet, actually. Madalena can ping me if I got this wrong. But within a week or two, there will be a set of resources on the book page. They're like an addendum to the book, and one of them is great questions to ask in a career development context, and that goes into a little bit more detail about. It's a longer rant about how a lot of career development, a lot of career coaching is very much focused on us. If we're going to be effective in our careers, it's important that we make the shift towards them. And we can do so with self-worth because we're okay already. You know, you don't need to prove yourself. The below the waterline in many career and business development conversations is this driving need to prove ourselves and prove our credibility. With self-worth, you don't have to. You've already got it. So you're free to explore, you're free to discover, you're free to ask the questions that I'm suggesting for you here as a little bit of homework, which is about them, i.e. the people that you want to impact and the people that you want to serve. Time, good. 10 to. Any comments, observations, questions? I will keep an eye on the the coaching work that I do in this space covers the topics that are there in front of you. The scheduling can be done either directly by email, or you can just do go to talktojohnnyland.com and help yourself. My diary on Tuesdays and Thursdays is open on the on that link. Probably, I mean, I guess it's pretty apparent that self-worth looks is the red line that runs through all of the above, and it certainly is the red line that runs through all of the events. So we have an event on the 20th of March, same as this webinar, on productivity. It's how self-worth is a game changer in productivity. Human space events running in 8 cities now. Next one in London. The next one that's coming up is in London on the 12th of March. It's on the website in the event section. It's also on Eventbrite. It's also on Facebook. It's called Human Space. Should be very, very easy to find. Love to see you. We have about 30 people coming. We have the upstairs in a bar called the Victoria near Lancaster Gate, very close to Hyde Park. We have the upstairs theatre bar where Charlie Chaplin once gave a speech to a crowd on the street below. We're not quite expecting a crowd on the street below. The human space is inside rather than outside. And the event is on the evening of the 12th of March. And finally, we're planning that facilitators course that I mentioned in the course of the call. It's the self-worth coaching and facilitators course from November the 3rd to the 10th in Portugal. That's for people who actually want to support others with their self-worth. It's a full end-to-end coach training program in 6 days. From the 3rd to the 10th of November. If you'd like further details on that, just ping me an email after the call. And finally, I almost forgot. In fact, I had to hastily copy the slide in before because I forgot to put it in the original pack. But as of last week, the Self-Worth Safari is on Amazon. So it's the this book. Opens for pre-orders. It's already available for pre-order, which will ship on the 21st, which is on the launch date. If you can help us to get that out there, if you can spread it amongst your friends, then that would be a huge help to us. Obviously, you know how it goes with Amazon. If we can actually just get it above a certain threshold on March 21st, then it kind of flies on itself from that. So reaching out to friends and colleagues everywhere to help us by placing a pre-order. So that's it for today. Anything else about us, if you haven't heard it already, is on the Self-Worth Academy, and I wish you all a really good afternoon. Bye for now.